Okay, everybody. Today I have a very special video for you that I know you're going to love. Uh, I have with me a awesome guest, Dr. Jonathan Howard, who is not only a frontline doctor who did a lot of work during the COVID pandemic to treat patients, but also has been a longtime science communicator, a writer at Science Based Medicine, and author of several books. And the reason he is here today is to talk about his most recent book, We Want Them Infected. So, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
So, why don't you start by introducing yourself and what your credentials are, and then we can start talking about the book.
Sure. My name is Dr. Jonathan Howard. I'm a neurologist and psychiatrist here at NYU in Bellevue Hospital in New York City. So I kind of have two lives kind of by day. That's what I do. I'm a neurologist and I round, all the time at hospitalized patients here at Bellevue Hospital. And I work at the Multiple Sclerosis Center. And then sort of by night, I kind of moonlight as someone who's very been involved in pro-vaccine advocacy. And I think that gave me two very important qualifications for writing the book, which is titled, by the way, We Want Them Infected. And I think we should definitely talk about the source of that title. But I think that my experience gives me two very important traits for writing this book. The first of these is I worked at Bellevue Hospital here in New York City throughout COVID. And so I worked throughout New York City's spring 3 years ago today. Our hospitals were deluged and overwhelmed with dying COVID patients. I've never experienced anything like this before. I saw more patients die in a week than I had in the past decade or my whole career. And this is nothing unique. Everyone who worked in a hospital experienced, the exact same thing. Everyone who lived in New York City will never forget the sirens just sort of wailing throughout. And meanwhile, in the hospital, it was airway team to this bed, airway team to this bed. Usually that pager goes off, once a day, I suppose, maybe. But it was every 10 minutes during COVID. And it's really amazing and sad how quickly that memory has faded, such that people are denying that New York City got hit hard by COVID at all, that it was all of this sort of illusion. And I think the second qualification that I bring to writing this book is that I've had this very quirky, odd interest in the anti-vaccine movement for over a decade now. This all started when a doctor that I trained with, I was friendly with, no personal animus here. A doctor by the name of Kelly Brogan morphed into one of the country's leading anti-vaccine doctors. She is a germ theory denier. She doesn't think HIV causes AIDS, but she's a great speaker. She's beautiful on stage, and she is very poised. Unlike us, she'll never do what I just did, to sort of stumble over a sentence or anything like that. And so I just became fascinated by this because she was not stupid. She went to MIT, she went to Cornell, and suddenly here she is sort of embracing these ultra crackpot ideas. And when I first encountered them, they were superficially plausible, right? If I was just to deluge someone who's unfamiliar with the anti-vaccine movement with anti-vaccine talking points, you can't just refute them all right away. But I had this very quirky interest, and I learned how to do this, and I learned everything I could about the anti-vaccine movement, standing on the shoulders of giants, people who've been doing this for long before I have. And in 2018, I co-wrote a book chapter in a book called Pseudoscience about the anti-vaccine movement. I wrote it with Dorit Rees, a law professor who's been a very staunch vaccine advocate. And so I was very well prepared for this moment, I think. And at some point, actually about 2 years ago is when it sort of first hit me, is that the ideas that I'd been hearing about measles, chickenpox, and the HPV vaccine were being recycled about the COVID vaccine and about COVID itself, especially for children and young people. I just started hearing all of these same familiar themes, except this time they weren't coming out of the mouths of just Kelly Brogan, but they were coming out of prestigious doctors at prestigious universities at Harvard, Stanford, UCSF, Johns Hopkins, our top universities, were publishing what seemed to me to be bog standard anti-vaccine content that was very similar to what I had been reading about measles and the HPV vaccines before the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first started my YouTube channel, one of the first claims I covered was one by a guy who goes by the initials JLW. You might know who that is. Um, and he was literally advocating for measles to come into schools and act as a sort of sentinel to warn immunocompromised kids that there's an outbreak before too much damage is done, which is just nuts. But that was a super fringe idea. And yeah, you're right. Now those basically identical ideas are being touted by Stanford professors about SARS-CoV-2 instead of measles. So that's got to be really confusing to the public to when they see Stanford professors saying things like that. So, uh, can you talk a little bit about how you see that misinformation has impacted society during this pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're exactly right that before there was a pro-virus movement before the pandemic. It was very small, but you can find articles suggesting that parents expose their children to chickenpox and expose them to measles. That we've existed with these viruses for thousands of years, that we have an immune system, that they're natural. And parents occasionally did this. In 2019, former governor of Kentucky, purposefully exposed his children to chickenpox, I guess on this theory that it's natural and vaccines aren't. And he had a quote, they were miserable for a few days, but they turned out fine. Of course, he took a small gamble. About 100 children died per year of chickenpox before the vaccine. They didn't have to be miserable for a few days. That's an unusual thing for a parent to do to a child. If I made my kid miserable for a few days by, pouring a caustic substance over their body, people would be horrified. The authorities would be made aware of that, I hope. And his children are a future risk for shingles. And a doctor who advocated for that before the pandemic would have been seen correctly as the crackpot of all crackpots. But that idea became mainstream, as you said, from professors from Stanford and Harvard and Oxford. And that's where the title of the book comes from. We want them infected. That was an email sent by a man by the name of Dr. Paul Alexander, who was a Canadian epidemiologist in the Trump administration. In some ways, everything you need to know about the book is contained in the title, that there was a purposeful movement to infect children with COVID with the idea that it would lead to herd immunity, the virus would all go away, and grandma, who had been safe at home in her apartment for just 3 to 6 months, we were told, could emerge into a world where COVID, we have herd immunity to COVID. And what effect did it have on this public? Well, I think it confused a lot of people. There are a lot of people out there who are under the mistaken belief that COVID is completely harmless for children and young adults, and they have more risk of, from the flu, which is not true. And as a result of that, pediatric COVID vaccination rates are exceedingly low. As a result of that, some children suffered and died in ways that they did not have to. Not a large number. It's not gun deaths. If I could instantly wipe off the planet, gun deaths or car crashes, if I had a vaccine against those, I'd be thrilled to use those, but we don't. But we do have a vaccine against COVID, and the pediatric death toll it's going slowly, thank God, but it's only going in one direction, and it just doesn't have to happen at all. 0 children need to suffer for lack of a vaccine, and we wouldn't tolerate that in 2019 with measles, HPV, chickenpox, polio, and we shouldn't tolerate that in 2023 with SARS-CoV-2. But this idea gained mainstream acceptance, and it was spouted at top universities, in newspapers, editorials. The former dean of Harvard said, we have to debate this. It's all quite reasonable. And as a result, parents were pacified about the virus. And again, most kids with COVID will do just fine. We don't know about the potential consequences of 10 infections. So I'm not trying to overstate things. Again, my kids had COVID. They were just fine. And I wasn't particularly worried. But they were vaccinated. So I increased their risk of a good outcome. And like I said, rare events multiplied millions, tens of millions of times add up. And COVID's toll on children easily equals or exceeds that of many other vaccine preventable diseases.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that um, one kind of, I guess, mantra I've been saying when it comes to this stuff is uh, no amount of suffering is acceptable for doctors and scientists. We don't look at children deaths under any circumstances and say, yeah, that's cool, that's acceptable. We try to make it better. And so, you're never going to eliminate those risks entirely, but choosing a path of more risk intentionally never made any sense. And yet, that's essentially what this Great Barrington Declaration idea does. It intentionally chooses a path of more risk, a lot more risk, and yet it's been embraced by a lot of people. So, I mean, how did this start? Who was kind of the first to fuel such ideas during this pandemic?
Most of the ideas can be traced to an editorial written by Dr. John Ioannidis in Stat News in March 17th, 2020. And for those people who don't know, Dr. John Ioannidis is maybe after Fauci, the country's most famous scientist. I mean, he's not exactly a household name, but he's a very famous, very admired, and well-honored scientist. He's won a bunch of awards, and he doesn't do a lot of primary research himself, but he sort of looks at science done by other doctors and scientists and sort of says, here's what's wrong with it and here's how you can do better. So he's really a guru of evidence-based medicine. And at the start of the pandemic, he wrote this article in Stat News saying that he thought, and he would kind of deny that he said this, that around 10,000 people would die. He said this would compare to an mid-season NBA game between the two most average teams. In an article published 2 days later, which didn't get as much attention, he said, if only we had devoted as much attention to stopping the flu as we are to stopping COVID, we would save thousands of lives. And that's not an exact quote, but it's basically what he said. And so he really thought that the pandemic was not going to be that bad. And there's a line in that news article from Stat News that closing schools may rob children of the opportunity to develop herd immunity. And, he clearly believed the virus was not much of a threat. On April 9th, 2020, he gave an interview in which he said he thinks 40,000 Americans were going to die this season. By that point in the pandemic, 20,000 people had already died and 2,000 were dying every day. And so he was essentially predicting the end of the pandemic at that instant. And indeed, within 8 days, his 40,000 deaths prediction had been obliterated. And, we all know what happened after that. And rather than sort of saying, I was wrong, I think I underestimated the virus, he started to say many things that became very familiar memes to those of us who have been fighting COVID misinformation. He said that a positive test for SARS-CoV-2 does not necessarily mean that that person died of the disease. And he was a ubiquitous media presence, sort of saying, we think people are dying, a lot of people are dying with COVID, not of COVID. He said that death certificates can't be trusted. He said eventually that doctors were killing patients through premature intubations, which is not true at all. The studies show the exact, not the exact opposite, some do, but there's no study I'm aware of saying that this happened. And wouldn't it have been great if all we had to do to save lives of COVID patients was nothing? You think we would have figured that out and stopped intubating them. And by the way, I will say, these sorts of accusations, these are much, much more severe and harsh than anything I say in my book. He is saying that overwhelmed frontline doctors dealing with a brand new virus, his exact quote, were just going crazy intubating people who didn't have to be intubated, like it was some game, like it was some joke. He wasn't there. Which is a major theme of the book too, is that very, very few of these doctors were there and took any risk themselves. But anyways, where was I? So he started spreading the myth that it was ventilators killing patients, that patients were dying from lockdowns, and that it was just old people with metastatic cancer who were about to die on a Saturday when instead the virus killed them on a Friday. And these memes became entrenched in large swaths of the American population, and they stopped taking COVID seriously after that. And I don't blame them. A very famous scientist speaking in great scientific diction, told them protect grandma. No one else has anything to worry about. And this was not just idle chatter. This made it all the way up to official policy. Scott Atlas, Trump's coronavirus czar, took this directly to Trump, directly to our nation's response, echoing John Ioannidis every step of the way. So this all had real world influence. This isn't just some sort of theoretical debate, or Twitter discussion. It became policy, and Trump started echoing a lot of this sort of stuff. We have to protect the vulnerable. GBD talking points.
So it sounds like you're saying that these people were heard on some of the highest platforms in the world, but they say that they're silenced. How does that work?
Well, they're very loud, silenced people. And I think that this is a way of fending off criticism. So they became pandemic celebrities. Let's be honest about that. They're not exactly household names, but they advise DeSantis, they advise Trump. They have a zillion podcasts and YouTube videos and editorials and Fox News interviews. And yeah, maybe YouTube took down one of their videos. And that was really the touchstone moment of the pandemic for those doctors. Really, the touchstone moment of the pandemic for me was seeing a young 23-year-old guy die during the first wave. That impacted me. I remember his name, and I remember talking to his aunt who raised him. But they remember a YouTube video being taken down. And this is a way of preempting criticism that, if you're too mean to me, that means you're trying to silence scientific discussion, this sort of thing. And several healthcare doctors, healthcare workers, have been silenced this pandemic, but they're not famous. You haven't heard about them because they've been silenced. Rick Bright, for example, is not a household name. He was the head of vaccine development. I'm going to get all my agencies confused, but he was essentially fired, I think, by the Trump administration in the summer of 2020 for correctly warning that America was going to have its darkest winter in history. And of course, the doctors and healthcare workers who have been truly silenced are those who died of COVID. So I can name some of my coworkers. None of you have heard of them. Maybe they wouldn't have been active on social media anyway, but they were silenced. Their voices are totally gone. And for these loud, famous doctors to act as if they are some of the pandemic's gravest victims, which they do, it's really telling and sad and kind of pathetic, to be honest.
Right. It comes from a kind of privileged place where they have their ideas that are getting proven wrong day by day, month by month, and that's very offensive to them. But they don't have to experience the death and suffering that the disease is causing on a daily basis in hospitals. So yeah, it's quite sad. But yet, like you said, they have been very influential. They've not exactly been silenced, and their ideas went pretty far. But luckily, we didn't end up actually implementing the Great Barrington Declaration itself, which was their kind of pseudo plan to deal with the pandemic. But we know that COVID is much more dangerous than what they were trying to portray. So can you talk about just how much worse it would have been if we had actually followed the Great Barrington Declaration?
Sure. So I think everyone, if you don't know what the Great Barrington Declaration is, probably most of you do, but should pause and read it. It takes about a minute. It's very short. You can go to their frequently asked questions page as well. That takes about 2 to 3 minutes to read, maybe a little bit longer. But the point is that their entire plan to control the pandemic could have been written in a couple hours. And for those who don't know, basically their plan was this. They correctly noted that there are people who are much less vulnerable to the virus than other people. And their idea was to have zero COVID for what they called vulnerable people. They really sort of dichotomized it, vulnerable, not, and to have zero COVID for the vulnerable people and pure COVID for the non-vulnerable people. They didn't recognize that some people could survive COVID. They sort of, the same way they said either you're vulnerable or you're not. They said either you survived with perfect lifelong natural immunity, or you died from the virus. And in order to do that, they suggested opening everything back up. Several of them, two of the three at least, suggested that young people kind of had an affirmative duty to go out and get infected with this virus. Martin Kulldorff, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, likened it to soldiers marching off to war in World War II, saying, your grandfather served their duty, and this is sort of your moment, which is much less risky, actually. But they felt that people had an obligation to young people to go get infected. I don't know if they did that themselves. I certainly didn't see actually anyone, in October 2020 sort of saying, wow, I just read this declaration, I'm going to go get myself infected. So I think a lot of people wanted the herd to be available for them. They just didn't want to be part of the herd. And for anyone who thinks they agree with the Great Barrington Declaration, if you did not purposely go get or live a normal life so that you would inevitably get infected before you were vaccinated, then you actually didn't agree with the Great Barrington Declaration. And, they wrote about the harms of lockdowns, and that's all they talk about is they want lockdowns and restrictions gone. They will claim that they had a plan to protect the vulnerable, but this plan consisted of essentially feed old people at home or let them move into hotels. And, this is not a plan. It was more sort of a list of demands that they had from public health workers. You will feed people at home. You will, identify vulnerable people. You will give people hotels when they need it. Just this, you must do 1,000 things all at once. It was as if you, had to set up NASA from scratch in 2 weeks. And when Dr. Bhattacharya, another one of the authors, was asked about his plan to feed old people at home a year later, he said something along the lines of, they could have used DoorDash. The idea of, 70 million Americans, using DoorDash, and it obviously just shows he was just thinking of off the top of his head. And, it was a fantasy that you could have, again, pure COVID on the one hand and zero COVID on the other. Vulnerable people are everywhere. We mix all the time, and all it takes is just one sort of bad interaction to start an exponential spread. They said children didn't spread the disease, which, I don't know if that was true in March 2020, but it certainly isn't true now. They didn't consider variants at every step of the way. They minimized variants. Delta's nothing to worry about. Omicron is nothing to worry about. The pandemic is over. Dr. J. Bhattacharya said the pandemic had been defanged. Six times that I found, maybe more. And then, it became a relic, not just because of variants, because they assumed that one infection meant you were done, but vaccines started 2 months later, in December 2020. And, their plan was to have 250, million American, not vulnerable Americans simultaneously get COVID in October, November, and December. And, they said that this would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months. So they told politicians, exactly what they wanted to hear, that you can end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months with minimal loss of life and no disruption to the economy. So it was just a sort of fantasy. If that was the case, where is our herd immunity? Right. And they're still anti-vaccine for young people. And they use absurd reasons that old people die 1,000 times more, which is true, I suppose, but that's not a good reason to let some kids die. And this document had very nefarious origins. They all met in Great Barrington Massachusetts. There was a camera crew there. There were journalists there. That's not normal when epidemiologists get together to talk shop. One of the people who sort of directed it was this man named Jeffrey Tucker, who was this sort of shady, far right-wing guy who seems like a villain out of Superman movies. He wrote an article in 2016 called "Let the Kids Work" that was literally pro-child labor. He wrote another article around that time suggesting that children should smoke because it's cool and you can quit before it does you any harm. So this guy who wants my daughter to drop out of high school so she can work at Chick-fil-A, that's where he said they could work,
Oh,
and to smoke with her friends during her shift, her break. He really influenced our country's policy, uh, not just towards children and young people, but as a whole. And of course, he has some, ties to racist organizations as well. That goes without saying.
mm. There's one thing that you said in there that I want to touch on, and it's this fantasy that we have, we could just somehow magically shield all of the quote unquote vulnerable people, which in their mind is just the elderly, even though there are lots of vulnerable people in the population, including people I'm sure they never thought about, like pregnant people.
Hmm.
Um, but this idea that we could just magically shield all of the old people, just it's there's so much classism and racism packaged up in there, because we know that most poorer households, which are mostly made up of people of color,
Hmm.
um, those households usually are more likely to have grandparents living with them. So, if we were to open everything up, kids, the working adults would go out into the world, risk contracting COVID and bringing it back home to the vulnerable people that they claim to protect. So, really, it's just a situation of let it rip and magically protect the old people. But if you have more COVID in a population, those old people are going to be more at risk, full stop. So, yeah, it was just a fantasy. And yet it had this political backing that I think gave it a lot of power. And you do a good job of highlighting that in your book. Is one of the many doctors that you quote extensively in your book of having a very just terrible track record of predictions and advice and claims during the pandemic. So, what has it been like for you to watch people like him and their messaging morph over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, it's not been a pleasant experience because a lot of these people I admired before the pandemic. So, in 2020, or when was this published? Anyways, a little bit before the pandemic, I published another non-bestseller book about cognitive errors in medicine. And I quoted some of these guys because I thought they had done good work. And, these guys know their stuff. They're sort of not, they're smart people. And it was pretty surprising to see some of them spout a lot of misinformation. And this is, I could talk about this for hours for any one of these guys, but just the false declarations that the pandemic was over, just the false stats, falsely claiming that the flu killed more people than COVID, for children at least, when in fact about 2,000 or over 2,000 children have died of COVID during the pandemic, and about 200 died of the flu. And this sort of stuff wouldn't have been controversial in 2019 if I said virus A killed 2,000 children, virus B killed 200, which is worse. Like, this would not have been controversial, but all this stuff became very controversial. And Dr. Prasad, has had a lot of shifting arguments about why children shouldn't be vaccinated. And his campaign against the pediatric COVID vaccine began before any children were vaccinated in the winter of 2021. Teenagers started getting vaccinated in the summer or May of 2021. And he was writing articles that children don't need COVID vaccines to go back to school, and saying that they're going to cause all sorts of fevers and headaches and who knows what else. Meanwhile, COVID isn't dangerous to children because more children die in car crashes, as if that means we should let some unvaccinated children die. Of course it doesn't. And he thought the pandemic, as a lot of people did, including a little bit myself, thought the pandemic might be abating 2 years ago. And his rationale was that if COVID is going away, if enough adults are going to be vaccinated, why should we take any risk vaccinating children? And then the Delta variant arrived, and then the Omicron variant arrived. And instead of saying we don't need to vaccinate children because COVID's going away, he said we don't need to vaccinate children because they already had COVID already. Now, they all have natural immunity. What's the point? But nowhere in between children don't need vaccines because COVID is going away and children don't need vaccines because they all got COVID did he turn into a vaccine advocate. Matter of fact, he kind of hurled insults at us, calling us stupid and off our rocker. And he's gotten to the point where he is defending Dr. Joseph Ladapo, who, blatant data fraud, the Andrew Wakefield of this pandemic. And I think if you had taken Vinay Prasad at the start of the pandemic and said, 3 years from now, you will be defending data fraud and, anti-vaccine data fraud in the middle of that pandemic, he would kind of be horrified. But I think this is really the power of what I call, not what I call, but, what other people call audience capture. Just the idea that he sort of became radicalized by his Twitter feed. And he got such positive feedback from making anti-vaccine comments. And people like myself, and you, and anyone who contradicted him were banned. And he's really gotten to the point now where he can't say things like, it's sad that 2,000 children died of COVID. We should have done something to prevent that, especially something as simple as a vaccine. And he treats vaccine side effects, as with many doctors, as a fate worse than death. Mm-hmm. And I really don't think I'm exaggerating here, because when he talks about children hurt by COVID, he mocks people who do it, say, oh, they're breathless fearmongers. More children die of car accidents, like I said. But when he talks about vaccine side effects, which are rare, and universally described in every single paper, I'm speaking about vaccine myocarditis, described as favorable. I mean, you don't want to minimize this because a vaccine, sent a child to the hospital with chest pain. Yeah, that's not a good thing. And if you run the numbers, I ballpark that about 1,000 children have suffered the side effect. Which is less than half of the number of children who died. And they're almost all going to do fine. That's what the papers say. I'm not trying to minimize it. I'm just quoting him when, I can read off 25 papers now saying, all patients in this series had a favorable course and were discharged with no symptoms after 2 days. And he treats that as a fate worse than death. He has done probably close to 30 YouTube videos on the topic, just speaking about it in this sort of ultra dramatic way. But death, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, which has affected about 10,000 children and killed about 75, that's rare. So you just got so you asked what it was like. It was sad. It was kind of shocking. I don't think he knows, but I reveal how much he has really come to parrot these anti-vaccine talking points. An article by Kelly Brogan about measles in 2019 is very similar to an article written by Vinay Prasad about COVID in 2023, which is shocking. And there's copious evidence that these vaccines work. I mean, you may read that they weren't studied in randomized controlled trials of children, when in fact 25,000 children were involved in 6 separate randomized controlled trials. They weren't large enough to show that these vaccines prevented death, because fortunately that's a very rare outcome and sort of hard to measure in a randomized controlled trial. You'd have to have one of the largest randomized controlled trials in the history of medicine to document that risk, which they say we should have done. In the middle of a raging pandemic, we should have just sort of, time out, everyone. Okay, let's study this. But, and since then, there have been around over 25 observational studies, all showing the same thing. The vaccine's not perfect. Just like for adults, it doesn't offer 100% of protection against bad outcomes. But it offers, it depends on the variant too. But it offers, it's better than zero. It offers a lot of protection. And, had we not vaccinated any children, all of these numbers that we're talking about would be much higher. I think that's a very sort of common theme, this pandemic, is that measures that we took that worked were used as evidence that they weren't necessary. So I sort of liken this to a quote from Homer Simpson, who yells at Marge, you maybe get all these smoke detectors and we haven't even had a fire yet. So the fact that we did a decent job of protecting children at the start of the pandemic was used as evidence that they never needed protection at all. And the reason that I speak so much about vaccines, first of all, is what I've been interested in for 10 years. But it's so simple, right? I'm not talking about closing schools, masking forever. I'm not talking about, locking kids away and never having them socialize or anything like that. I'm talking about, three shots, something like that. And we could have saved a lot of lives. We did save a lot of lives. I think it's important to say no matter what happens in the future, if a new variant comes and it evades immunity, we have to start from scratch. The vaccine has already protected a lot of children.
Hmm. The more people who understand disinformation that became so prevalent during this pandemic, the more people understand why it is wrong, the better prepared we'll be for the next pandemic. And so I think in that vein, I want to start asking uh, some questions that maybe an anti-vaxxer or someone who didn't like lockdowns, didn't like mandates, not necessarily an anti-vaxxer, whatever, maybe ask you some questions what that kind of person might be asking you. So from what I've seen from the people who don't like lockdowns and mandates, they will always talk about how lockdowns were unhealthy, and uh, they criticize medical professionals and messaging agencies for not emphasizing a healthy diet or exercising. But to me, I wasn't aware that doctors stopped recommending those things. So, were you aware that they had stopped recommending those things for the pandemic?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I didn't like lockdowns either. My children were, remote schooling for over a year, and that hurt them. And it's sad that my daughter's high school experience, is going to be affected by COVID and her memories that way. And it was horrible in New York City. The city that I love, seeing every day like Thanksgiving and Christmas, just kind of a ghost town. It was horrible, and uh, you know, the same way that I said that a lot of these doctors were spared the worst of COVID, I want to stress that I was spared the worst of lockdowns. I was never lonely. I was, I think I social distanced 5 days of the entire pandemic. At the very end of New York City's spring COVID wave, and at the very end of May or beginning of June, I socially distanced for a week. So I was never lonely. I never was worried about my income and a paycheck. So I was spared the worst of that. And I definitely want to count my blessings and acknowledge that. Um, but, yes, the idea that, we spoke about the Great Barrington Declaration, sort of a fantasy and making, very difficult things sound easy. Yeah, it would have been great if we could have solved the obesity epidemic in March 2020. And gotten people to exercise. Not that obesity is always due to a lack of exercise. I know most people who are overweight exercise a ton, so they're not lazy. I don't want to spread that myth, but the point is that these are very complex problems, and we could not have solved them. And yes, looking back, we didn't have to close parks and skateboarding parks and outdoor things. But I think that, number one, we should judge the decisions that were made in March 2020 by what we knew then, not what we know now. And someone who caused people to overreact to COVID, someone who washed their mail or, still wears a mask outside, if they don't, because they're so afraid of getting COVID. I mean, probably did a lot less damage than people who said, you're under 65, you have zero risk.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of the people who listened to that and lived their life as they were instructed to without fear, they're not here to tell their story today. So this is really survival bias. And I imagine if we could bring, several 100,000 people back to life right now, they would say, yeah, I should have gotten the vaccine. I should have, tried to avoid the virus a little bit harder. Yes, I wish we could have gotten everyone up and exercising and eliminated every possible medical morbidity that led to a worse outcome in COVID. But that's easier said than done. And if someone disagrees with me, they should do it. Do it. Solve the obesity epidemic and solve the sedentary lifestyle epidemic that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Be my guest. No one's stopping. The way our conversation is going will be very kind of similar experience to a reader, where you just toggle back and forth between this fantasy world where COVID's going away, only grandma is affected, and all you have to do is protect the vulnerable, and then you can open schools, and everything will be just fine. And then the sort of real world of, yeah, that stuff was a lot harder than you made it sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's much easier to write open schools than to open schools. And schools were closed not just by overly cautious Democratic politicians, but schools were closed by overwhelming outbreaks of the virus.
Hmm.
And because they didn't have enough teachers here in New York City during our first wave, 74 Department of Education employees died, something like 70 of whom were in schools, 30 of whom were teachers. But you know what? We don't hear from them because they're dead. They're no longer here to share their experience. And
Right.
even Sweden, one of my articles for Science-Based Medicine was called, Yes, Sweden Closed Schools. And it was largely based on a woman who I think must live there, who just posted about 100 screenshots of newspaper articles of schools closing in
Mhm.
Sweden. And if you talk to parents there, their schools were, their children weren't in schools for long periods of time. And even when schools were open here, it didn't necessarily mean students were in classrooms learning. The National Guard had to be called in to teach during the Omicron wave here. My kids, at least, during a couple of weeks, just sat in the auditorium and were sort of babysat.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a big difference between saying open schools and actually having children in schools learning, or protect the vulnerable and actually protecting the vulnerable,
Mhm.
uh, between saying run an RCT and actually running an RCT. But there was this whole sort of commentariat class who did what we're doing now. They just had conversations with each other on YouTube, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't. If that's all that you did, um, I don't think that's necessarily the most admirable thing, especially when you made it this, people on the ground, when you made their job sound easy, and
Mhm.
when they inevitably failed to do the very easy things that you suggested, they became instant convenient scapegoats. So, public health officials were supposed to do, all these incredible things, protect the vulnerable, open
Mhm.
schools. And when they invariably failed, they were just pilloried, sometimes physically, violently attacked.
Yeah.
None of the doctors that I write about, promoted that. I want to be very clear about
Mhm.
that. But they likened public health professionals to Nazis, and what are we supposed to do with Nazis? We're supposed to fight them. They're the worst people who ever existed. They're barbarians who tortured, and that's what people did. They fought who they thought were Nazis.
Ugh. So, who are some of the people who likened uh, medical professionals on the front lines to Nazis? Because I think we should call them out.
So too, Kelly Brogan. Actually, so there were many, many people on sort of the ultra quack side who did, but Kelly Brogan did. And this is what I was saying. Her words became sort of plagiarized. Dr. Vinay Prasad wrote this article with this sort of fantasy that will public health measures lead to the next Hitler, essentially.
Oh, God.
And it was this sort of fantasy that a future dictator could rise to power under a future pandemic and seize power and declare martial law and lock everyone in their homes. It was just this oppression fantasy. So we talked
Wow.
about how these doctors are constantly feeling oppressed, that they're being silenced. There was a lot of that were the real victims here. And you know what? Hey, is it possible? Sure. But it's never happened before. And in fact, the people waving Nazi flags at rallies were actually the ones who were protesting COVID restrictions, not the ones trying to enforce them. So that's, talk about toggling back and forth between the imaginary world and the real world. Very sad commentary.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that he had said that. That is uh, surprising, but I think that just goes to show. I mean, your book is full of quotes, direct quotes from doctors such as Vinay Prasad and many others that are just very revealing. If people want to get all of those juicy quotes and your breakdown of them, I highly recommend they go read your book. And now that we have talked about these people who fantasize solutions to complex problems, let's talk maybe about what we can do better to combat disinformation in the next pandemic or before the next pandemic. Can we spitball any ideas on what maybe our own institutions or universities or what we as communicators can do and do better to uh, fight this disinformation?
Yeah, so that's a important question, and there's no easy answers to this because you have to be careful what you label misinformation. You don't want people who are sort of genuinely thinking outside the box, or sort of true pandemic controversies. Like, if you tell me that a child has had 2 vaccines and an Omicron infection, do they need a booster? I don't know. I'm not going to call that person anti-vaccine. And the woman, one of the heroes of the mRNA vaccine development, this woman, Kariko, who's close to you at the University of Penn, right?
Yeah.
She was, I think, kind of laughed off, her science before she became one of the people who helped save millions of lives. So we got to be very careful before we label things misinformation. And I think we also have to be careful before we try to sanction people with the official power of the state and medical license boards. I mean, God forbid Ron DeSantis wins and Ladapo becomes our Surgeon General, and these laws are in place, he'd come after us. I mean, we may not be big enough on his radar, but he'd come after people like us in a heartbeat, saying that we're the ones spreading disinformation. So I'm very wary that anytime I suggest a government get a power, that what would it be like if my enemy, and I don't feel guilty calling, but Ladapo, and enemy type, what would happen if he got that power? So I think the most important thing to do is what I, and thousands of other people have been doing, is really sort of speak up. But you and I, we're I have, I'm a very powerful person on the 7th floor of Bellevue, but that's it. That's where the neurology office is located. But a lot of department chairmen, for example, have shown, great timidity. Is that a word? Timidity? Cowardice. I'll just say that,
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Been very timid, in calling out misinformation, in their department. I mean, Monica Gandhi has declared the pandemic over 57 times by now, with nary a word from the people there. And they don't have to silence her. They don't have to threaten her job. I'm not calling for any of that, but I think that they just have to speak out. There have been medical students who have been braver, I think, in calling out medical misinformation amongst their tenured professors than department chairmen. And so I really think that debunking misinformation needs to be seen not just as sort of a niche thing that sort of on doctors do in their spare time, but a fundamental obligation of ours and duty of ours to speak up when we see people saying things that are just blatantly wrong, like a virus that killed 200 children is worse than one that killed 2,000. And much of the pandemic has reminded me of the emperor's new clothes, right? That there's a naked emperor, and people are saying, oh, he's dressed in beautiful garments because of his stature and his reputation. And I think that we have to be willing to say naked emperors are naked.
I've taken up a lot of your time here, Jonathan. So I want to thank you for joining me. And
I could talk about this stuff all night. I mean,
me too.
We've really only just scratched the surface. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate it tonight, and all that you've been doing for the past 3 years too. It's been a great service, and I love your videos.
Everyone, you can go buy Jonathan's book, We Want Them Infected, now available on Amazon. Please go check it out, gift it to a friend, read it for yourself. It's a great book. I will highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for the kind words.
All right, Jonathan, you take care.
All right, bye-bye.